Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Equity, Inclusion, and the Strategic Imperative and the Call for Proposals Process. My name is Tom Murray, and I use he, him, and his pronouns. I'm the Director for New Student Experiences at the University of Arizona and the Vice Chair for General Programs for the ACPA 2018 Convention in Houston. I am joined by one of my colleagues from the convention planning team, Danny Barker. Danny, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Danny Barker, and I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions and Pre-College Programs for the undergraduate program in the Wisconsin School of Business, and I also serve as the Equity and Inclusion Liaison to the programming team for the 2018 convention. A quick note for you all, I'm actually on my way to Texas right now, so I'm sitting in an airport, so if you hear some noise in the background, my apologies. It's just them, trying to get everyone to the appropriate flights.
Thanks, Danny. So in today's webinar, we are hoping to accomplish a few things. First, we will provide an overview of the ACPA Equity and Inclusion Statement, including a new way in which it is integrated into the call for proposals. We will also provide an overview of the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization, a little bit about its history and its importance to the association and the field. Within the context of this webinar, though, we want to provide some concrete examples of how the strategic imperative is related to the work that we do and, as such, the proposals that we submit for convention. We will also provide some best practices for submitting an inclusive proposal and developing an inclusive session. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for questions, but please feel free to use the questions module of the webinar throughout the session. This session is being recorded and will be available on the ACPA website a few days after the webinar. After we've concluded the content for the webinar, we will stop the recording and remain in the webinar space for anyone who would like to process their own proposal ideas and how they might relate to the strategic imperative. ACPA has an equity and inclusion statement that predates the strategic imperative, and we wanted to spend some time on that here. ACPA, College Student Educators International, actively promotes and recognizes principles of fairness, equity, and social justice in relation to and across intersections of race, age, color, disability, faith, religion, ancestry, national origin, citizenship, sex, sexual orientation, social class, economic class, ethnicity, gender identity, gender expression, and all other identities represented among our diverse membership. By appreciating the importance of inclusion, we acknowledge that the collective and individual talents, skills, and perspectives of members, constituent groups, and partners foster a culture of belonging, collaborative practice, innovation, and mutual respect. ACPA seeks to empower and engage professionals, scholars, and partners in action that productively contribute to accomplishing the goals of our association. Now, if you have submitted a proposal in the past, you might recall that you have had to indicate that your proposal complies with the equity and inclusion statement. This year, we have changed the call for proposals so that you are asked to provide a brief, 100-word maximum explanation as to how your proposal meets the expectations for the equity and inclusion statement. While this change may seem small, it is a significant paradigm shift from acknowledging compliance to intentionally reflecting on your proposal's merits from an equity and inclusion perspective. In the proposal process, we encourage you to consider how your proposal actively supports the association's values of equity and inclusion. In November 2016, the Governing Board, Assembly Leadership, and International Office gathered in Alexandria, Virginia, to discuss a variety of issues related to mission, values, and the future of ACPA. Out of this meeting was born the strategic imperative. ACPA will direct resources, energy, and time toward addressing racial justice in student affairs and higher education around the world. Our lens is intersectional, intentional, and directed. The focus is on reducing the oppression of communities of color at the intersections of their identities, knowing that all oppressions are linked and that the work is ongoing. Our goal is to provide leading research and scholarship, tools for personal, professional, and career development, and innovative practice opportunities for members that will actively inform and reshape higher education. We move toward this goal knowing that the roles and daily tasks of our jobs are important to the functioning of colleges and universities. We also know that racial justice and the tasks of our jobs do not sit as dichotomous poles. Racial justice is at our core. It underlies the work we each must do every day in every way we can.
It feels like the why should be a given with the events that we continue to see around the country, like Ferguson, Baltimore, Charlottesville, and so many more, combined with what's happening on our campuses. But to share a more concrete why from our past president, Donna Lee spoke to this early on in the process. She said, "This strategic imperative is an authentic demonstration of who we are as an association. In conceptualizing racial justice, our lens is intersectional, intentional, and directed. The focus is on reducing the oppression of communities of color at the intersections of their identities, knowing that all of our oppressions are linked and that the work is ongoing. Our goal is to provide leading research and scholarship, tools for personal, professional, and career development, and innovative praxis opportunities for our members that will actively inform and reshape higher education. We move toward this goal knowing that the roles and daily tasks of our jobs are vitally important to the functioning of our colleges and universities. And we also know that racial justice and the tasks of our jobs do not exist as dichotomous poles. We believe racial justice is at our core. It underlies the work we each must do every day and every way we can." In June, our current president, Stephen John Quay, shared that he had received feedback from the Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous Network, NAIN, about the imperative not reflecting their experiences with colonization. As a result of that feedback, and to be more inclusive of the experiences of Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous people, the association leadership decided to expand the imperative and call it the Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice and Decolonization.
So I was fortunate enough to be at July leadership meeting in Houston, along with other members of the convention planning team, where we had some members of the Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous Network do a presentation to really help us understand why decolonization was important to add to the strategic imperative and how it is different from racial justice. And they were able to make it concrete. They gave us a few really great examples, including the United States history of using Indian boarding schools that were specifically designed to eradicate Native culture and to make Native Americans adopt white culture and white ways of being. They also spoke about the ways in which Native identities are politically determined, that in order to identify as Cherokee or in order to identify as Navajo, that there are political ways that you are able to do that, and because of that, political ways that you are not able to do that. And because of these and other reasons, they really pushed us to think about how decolonization as a goal, in addition to racial justice, is really important. We also talked a lot about reflecting on our own positionality. And this is one of the 5 goals of the convention planning team overall, is to get our association members to reflect on our own positionality and thinking about how the identities that we hold affect the way that we show up to do this work every day. And I will be sharing an example of how my own positionality has affected the way I understand the strategic imperative. Within the scope of convention and program proposals, we thought it might be helpful to make the imperative concrete within the context of our 10 professional competencies. These 10 competencies, identified by ACPA and NASPA as central to the work of student affairs, are the focus of the work that we do. Every convention proposal will need to have at least one of these competencies identified as a focus of the session. While the strategic imperative may more obviously relate to some of them, the connections to others may not be as clear. As a way to encourage bigger picture thinking, we will go through each competency and offer just a few suggestions on how the strategic imperative may relate to work in that domain. These examples may not relate to proposals you are considering, but they will hopefully provide a springboard for your reflection for how your topic relates to the imperative. First, alphabetically, is advising and supporting. Earlier, we spoke about the need to reflect on our own positionality, and this affects the advising and supporting relationship greatly. The worldview that we bring to an advising relationship, undoubtedly affected by our experience of race and colonization, can change that relationship. How might experiences of race and colonization affect the ways in which we offer our advising? How might it affect the ways in which our students ask for help? Or perhaps more importantly, why they may not ask for help? As a student affairs professional, when I am advising a student group, do I consider how their experience of racial battle fatigue might be affecting their ability to attend appropriately to their academics? Do the supporting interventions we develop, often designed to encourage students to conform to expectations of academia, actually reinforce colonization? These are just a few questions that one might consider when thinking about how the imperative might relate to this competency. Assessment, evaluation, and research is the next competency we will discuss. One of the ways in which I see the strategic imperative relating to this competency is thinking about how we are constructing the assessment, evaluation, and research we are doing, and how we then attempt to use it. We experience this often when we focus on, quote, foundational research in higher education, largely normed around white students. In our own assessment and evaluation, how are we sampling students? Do we exclude certain groups from analysis because there just aren't enough, as is often the case in the literature for Native American students? Also, in this, quote, culture of accountability, when we are often asked to show in the numbers the efficacy of our work, how do we ensure that the qualitative voices of marginalized students are not silenced by quantitative findings? How do we integrate counter-narratives into our evaluation? Next, let's consider law, policy, and governance. If you are submitting a proposal that focuses on this competency, there are likely many ways for you to consider the strategic imperative, as this competency focuses on systems and structures that are often marginalizing. This may be things that are on the state, national, or international level, such as immigration law, as it affects childhood arrivals and their access to education. This may also be institution-level policies. For example, are Native students permitted to engage in smudging in their residence hall room when it involves burning? Considering governance at an institutional level, are there structures in place that encourage marginalized students to engage in student government? Leadership is an interesting competency to consider within this context, as the very ways in which we define leadership are shaped by experiences of race and colonization. Are we defining it as a role that an individual has, as a relational process, as a community responsibility? Who are the role models upon which we build our conceptions of leadership? How many of our senior administrators are people of color? In a graduate class I took on critical race theory, I led a discussion on microaggressions, and to elaborate on the idea of environmental microaggressions, I did an audit of all of the buildings on my campus named after people, supposedly university and community leaders who gave time, money, or both to the institution. This was well over 100 buildings, and I found that all but 3 were named after white people. Of those 3, one is the Cesar Chavez building that houses Mexican American Studies. One is the MLK building that houses African American Student Affairs. And the third is the Manuel Pacheco Integrated Learning Center, which is completely underground and not visible, and which nobody calls by its full name. It is known on campus just as the ILC. These kinds of analyses of how leadership is defined, portrayed, and institutionalized are critical to our work. This brings me to one of my favorite examples of how the strategic imperative relates to all of our work, because it involves my own process of reflection. When I first considered how the strategic imperative might affect convention and proposals, I initially thought to myself, but some of the things I present at convention don't have anything to do with race or racial justice. Specifically, I was thinking of a session I have done a couple of times with a colleague on giving critical feedback to underperforming employees, clearly related to the organizational and human resources competency. This session has been greatly attended, has received very good feedback, but on the surface is not about race or racial justice. But that was from my own positionality as a white person working in this field. When I reflected on this more, I realized that this topic was about power structures which are inevitably affected by race. Furthermore, some of the things for which managers often have to give critical feedback, such as, quote, professionalism, are also deeply connected to race and colonization. What does professionalism mean? Am I judging someone's, quote, professional attire based on white standards? Do I negatively evaluate somebody for an inability to work independently when so many cultures highly value collective effort? And so this year, my co-presenter and I are adding content to our proposal to reflect on the ways in which race and colonization influence the process of critical feedback.
Next, we will look at personal and ethical foundations. This competency focuses on the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to develop and maintain integrity in one's life and work. It includes thoughtful development, critique, and adherence to a holistic and comprehensive standard of ethics and commitment to one's own wellness and growth. It requires a focus on external ethical guidelines as a means to maintain integrity. When we talk to students and professionals about ethics, do we do so from a lens that is largely based on white ideals? What cultures and cultural values are used to develop the standard code of ethics or ethical guidelines that our profession is founded on or claims to hold on to? Next, we'll discuss social justice and inclusion, perhaps the easiest competency to relate to the imperative. For the purpose of this competency area, social justice is defined as both a process and a goal that includes the knowledge, skills, and dispositions needed to create learning environments that foster equitable participation of all groups and seeks to address issues of oppression, privilege, and power. This competency involves student affairs educators who have a sense of their own agency and social responsibility that includes others, their community, and the larger global context, which very much aligns with the goals of the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. The student learning and development competency area addresses the concepts and principles of student development and learning theory. This includes the ability to apply theory and models to improve and inform student affairs and teaching practice. What are the dominant perspectives?
I think that we may have lost Danny, so I'm going to pick up.
Apologies. My apologies. What are the dominant perspectives present in the models and theory of student learning and development? Are the informal and formal theories that we as professionals are asked to employ based on the experiences of a broad range of students in college or a narrow pocket of students that we interact with regularly? This competency requires we move from theory to practice. In doing so, are we as professionals constructing programs, services, policies, and procedures that are inclusive to all identities? Technology. This competency focuses on the use of digital tools, resources, and technologies to advance student learning, development, and success. This includes the creation of digital literacy and digital citizenship within communities of students, professionals, and institutions of higher learning. When designing technological resources, do we truly focus on learning and development that is inclusive of all students? Who might we be leaving out and relying so heavily on online platforms and technology? How do we decide which platforms are used and which students are already using the ones we select? How are uses of social media normed around the typical read-white student or professional experience? How does the perceived anonymity of online environments fuel racist sentiments and allow for more hate speech? The last competency area is values, philosophy, and history. This competency area is about connecting these pieces to current practice. There are direct ties to the assessment, evaluation, and research competency that Tom discussed earlier. Research, scholarship, and practice grow out of the values, philosophy, and histories of the profession. This competency asserts that strong professionals understand the values, philosophy, and history of our profession and use it to inform practice. Similar to the questions I posed around personal and ethical foundations, I would ask what has informed the values and philosophy of our field. Who are the professionals that created the foundational values and philosophy and corresponding documents, like the competencies that we're talking about today for our profession? Now that we've talked through each of the competencies, we want to spend a few minutes talking through a few areas you may want to focus on in your program proposal. The first being the area of the call for proposals that asks you to discuss the purpose or rationale for your program. Because we need to start with the end in mind, the purpose or rationale should be a driving force behind your proposal. Strong proposals, and therefore sessions, will be able to make a direct tie to the strategic imperative given the need for us as professionals to do so in all our work. We encourage you to spend time in this section making that connection and discussing how your session relates to the work of the strategic imperative and is relevant to student affairs and higher education. As Tom and I both talked about earlier, it's crucial that we look at the foundational research, theories, models, and literature in our field. This means we need to do so in our proposals as well, particularly the theoretical framework section. This holds true when thinking about what theories, models, and research you use in your proposal. We cannot claim to be about racial justice and yet only stick to the traditional quote-unquote canon of literature. We also wanted to share a few tangible things to think about when creating both your proposal and presentation. While these may seem fairly basic, they are critical in creating a baseline inclusive program. When thinking about your title and abstract, it's important to make sure you're using inclusive language. This will be the first and primary impression for folks interested in attending your session, and as such, needs to make sure to reflect inclusive language and hence practices. It's important when designing your session to consider what quote-unquote engagement looks like and how different abilities engage. From space setup to group work, it's important to make sure that you consider what might be restrictive for some folks and possibly turn others away or leave them wanting to disengage in your session. When I present, I prefer to have people move around the room. But given restrictions on rooms at convention, I've learned that I need to adjust things because the rooms might not be conducive to large-scale movement of the masses. While this may seem basic, uploading PowerPoint slides prior to convention can be incredibly helpful. As a capital P procrastinator, I understand the constraints of uploading slides before I get on a plane. But knowing how helpful and necessary it is for some of my colleagues, it's something that we all need to be doing. Along the same lines of requiring a little advanced planning, providing large print materials is a small thing you can do to deliver a more inclusive experience for session participants. When designing your session, it's important to think about how you will create space for participants to engage. Varying participation modalities are key to making sure that multiple identities and learning styles are engaged and feel included. The last thing we want to say before we move on is that it's not about expecting perfection. Tom and I did a presentation at ACPA a number of years ago. During an open reflection time, we had music playing. At the time, we thought it was a fun way to engage folks in the room. At the end of the presentation, one of the participants came forward to let us know they had a learning disability, and having music playing during a time they were trying to focus in on reflecting was incredibly distracting and detrimental to their learning. While it didn't feel good to know that we had made it difficult for someone to learn in one of our sessions, I'm glad we had opened up space for folks to provide feedback, and we learned from that feedback and have made adjustments in all of our presentations since. We realize that this can be overwhelming. There are a lot of pieces to making sure that we are providing as inclusive a space as possible. No one expects us to be perfect. We have to do the best we can and then be open to and ask for feedback and learn from that feedback and do better next time. Also would like to say, make sure that you rely on all of the resources out there, including Tom and I. We're here to help as much as we can.
So before we wrap up the content portion of the webinar, we wanted to share a few other resources Danny mentioned that she and I are a resource to you, as are the entire convention steering team, which is a small group of folks that provides leadership for the planning process, and the larger convention planning team, who are available to answer questions that you have about convention in general, and the call for proposals specifically. To contact a member of the steering team, you can visit this direct URL at the top, the first URL on the screen, or you can visit convention.myacpa.org and click on the ACPA 18 team link at the top menu. This will provide a list of the steering team members and their email addresses. At the bottom of the list of steering team members, there is a link to the full planning team as well. You can also refer back to this webinar once it is posted on the convention website, along with the recording of our first webinar on the proposal process that is currently available. These and several short micro sessions are available by visiting convention.myacpa.org. From the homepage, use the curriculum menu item and select presenter resources. This page also has the universal design principles we previously mentioned, as well as Word and PDF versions of the call for proposals, and that would be the second URL that's listed on this slide. Just a few reminders about the proposal and program timeline. The call for proposals is currently open and it's due Friday, September 8th. That's also the date that the applications to be a program reviewer are due, and we do highly encourage you to apply to be a program reviewer. It's something that I've done for about 10 years now and continue to do because it's a great way to see other research that is out there. We ask for the reviews to be complete by September 29th, and you do see there is a bit of time in between that and notifications to presenters. That is because there's a few things that has to happen in between reviews completing and that notification. So you would find out if your proposal was accepted at October 25th. Once those notifications are sent out, we do ask that presenters commit by November 3rd to attend the convention and present their session, which gives us a little bit of time then to do time and space placements and to send out time and space notifications by December 4th. If you do not plan to or do not have the funding to stay for the entire length of convention, we do recommend that you not make travel arrangements until time and space notifications have been made, so as we cannot take requests for session days or session times. So at this point, we'd like to invite any questions that folks might have regarding the content of today's webinar. And then if there, after we're done with questions, we will move on to turning off the recording and then using this as a brainstorming space. Okay, well, not seeing any questions popping up in the questions module, and we'll have time for those later as well. We would like to thank you for joining us today. Danny's and my email addresses are listed here. Feel free to contact me at tam@email.arizona.edu or Danny at daniellebarker@me.com. At this point, we're going to conclude the recording of the webinar, but Danny and I will remain in this webinar space if anyone would like to have time to discuss their proposal. We will also